Hi, today we're going to talk about the blood vessels of the circulatory system. There's three main types of blood vessels. You've got your arteries, you've got your veins, and you've got your capillaries or capillaries. Now if we focus on some structure and function of each of them, that's key throughout this course, is the bio part of the course, is how does structure relate to function. One of the misconceptions about arteries, and something they sometimes will ask on the diploma exam, is about arteries and the type of blood that they contain. Most of the time, arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. But you can't say that all arteries carry oxygenated and veins carry deoxygenated. And what I mean by that is oxygenated blood, higher concentration of oxygen. Deoxygenated blood would be a lower concentration of oxygen, typically a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. Now, the reason I say you can't say it all the time is when we did our discussion on the heart in the last video clip, you saw that the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins were the exception to that rule. Pulmonary arteries carrying blood from the right ventricle to the lungs, and that was deoxygenated blood. And blood came from the lungs back to the heart through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and that was oxygenated blood. It came from the lungs, so it was oxygenated. The blood going to the lungs was deoxygenated, and that was in an artery. So that's the exception, pulmonary veins and pulmonary arteries. Now, when we talk about arteries themselves, arteries always carry blood away from the heart. That's an easy way to remember arteries with the A, away from the heart. Whereas a vein is always going to be a blood vessel that's returning blood back towards the heart. So real simple, arteries away, veins towards. Now in between the arteries and the veins you have these smaller blood vessels called capillaries. And capillaries are really small branches. They're about 1 cell thick. So red blood cells, for example, have to line up single file and squeeze through those thin little capillaries. And that's important because that allows for really efficient exchange of materials, nutrients, wastes, gases, etc. If you had a number of tissue layers, if you had 5 or 6 different tissue layers, and you had to, let's say, diffuse oxygen through 5 or 6 tissue layers, it's going to take a lot longer for diffusion to happen through a number of cell layers than it would to just happen through a single layer. So the wall of a capillary is only going to be 1 cell thick, and that allows for really efficient exchange of material. Now, here's a picture of some of the structural parts of arteries and veins. You can see an artery is very thick, really muscular, quite elastic, so it can stretch. You can see muscle tissue with elastic fibers. Veins, hard to really see from this diagram, but the wall of the artery is much thicker. If you look at the hole, the opening in the blood vessel, the vein has more space than inside of the artery. And that's important because arteries, being so close to the heart, need to accommodate the extra blood flow. So they need to be able to expand and contract to keep blood pressure relatively constant, fairly high, so that it can circulate the blood around the body. Now, in between arteries and veins, we have these capillary or capillary beds, and those would be the cells, the tissue layers or tissue areas where that exchange of gases and nutrients would happen. Now, there's some other ones. We call them arterioles and venules. So if we had an artery, and that artery branches, so like right here's a branch, there's another branch right there, we would call that an arteriole. And when the capillaries come together, when they start merging together, they'll merge together into larger blood vessels called venules. And a number of these venules will come together and lead into a larger vein. Now, veins also have something kind of unique here. They have these things called valves, and we'll talk about that in a second. There's a diagram that shows some of the major blood vessels in the body. So we talked about the vena cava, the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. We talked about the aorta going up into the head, and aorta going around the backside of the heart down into these capillary beds in the major tissue areas. We already talked about this. Again, reiterating that arteries are very thick and muscular so they can accommodate that extra blood flow. Capillaries being the places where oxygenation of the blood can happen and exchange of nutrients and wastes with the cells. And then veins being far away from the heart, being the farthest blood vessels from the heart and not having the really thick muscular elastic walls. Veins have a problem of getting blood back to the heart, especially if you were a vein down in the feet and you were trying to get the blood in a vein to return back to the chest. The biggest problem here is this: gravity. Gravity is always there. Gravity is always pushing down, and that would cause the blood to constantly drain down into your feet. There's such low pressure in the blood in a vein that gravity would win the force race, right? Gravity would be a bigger push down than the blood pressure would be a push up. So what blood vessels need to be able to do to accommodate and create, I guess, the pressure or overcome the lack of pressure is inside those veins we have one-way valves. And those prevent, just like in the heart, they prevent the backflow of blood. I'll show you here in this diagram how this happens. Here you've got a vein in the leg. Here you've got these valves in their closed positions. So imagine if there's some blood in this section, okay? And then there's some blood that's in this section right here. When these valves are closed, the blood that's in this section here can't drop back down into this section. Gravity would always be trying to push it back down, but because this little door, if you want to think of it that way, this valve is closed, the blood, once it's up here, can't go down here. Now, when the heart beats and blood comes down from the heart through the leg into the capillaries to oxygenate the muscles in your leg and drop off the food, imagine that the blood that's right here gets pushed from behind from the blood that came from the heart a couple beats ago. So the blood here will push through that valve, so kind of like this is showing it here, how that valve will open and the blood will go into this next area. And then when we have diastole, remember diastole is when the heart isn't beating, in between contractions, gravity would take over and gravity would cause the blood to drop back down. There's not enough force, there's not enough pressure for the blood to move through this next valve here. So the blood that was down in this chamber has now moved into this chamber. It got pushed ahead during systole when the ventricles contract, but then during diastole when the pressure is lower, the blood would sag back down into the feet. But because that valve is right there, and because that valve is only a one-way valve opening in one direction, the blood that's now here can't drop back down into your feet. So it's almost a sequence of a push, and then in between beats it drops, but the valve is closed. The next time the heart beats, pushed through that valve, in between beats it would drop back down, and this valve holds the blood up in the next little chamber, and we slowly work it back up towards the heart. So valves really important for maintaining that blood flow from the feet and the lower extremities back into the chest. Now for blood pressure, there's a lab that we did in class. I'd recommend looking at the YouTube video on the website that shows how to take the blood pressure. You're responsible for the steps associated with taking the blood pressure, what those numbers stand for, what an average blood pressure is, and so on. So I would recommend going, if you missed this, to review through the steps for taking the blood pressure on our website. Now there are two parts to blood pressure, and we talked a little bit about this with the heart cycles. There's systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure, again, remember, is when the ventricles are contracting, so you're going to get a surge, a higher pressure when the ventricles contract, and then you're going to get a diastolic pressure when the ventricles are relaxed. Average blood pressure would be approximately 120 over 80, where again 120 is your systolic number and 80 is your diastolic. So if you can imagine holding your fist, and when your fist contracts, that would be like the ventricles contracting. You can feel the pressure in your fist when you squeeze it. So when the ventricles contract, there's higher pressure. That's systolic. And then if you relax your hand, that would be sort of like the ventricles relaxing. You can feel the pressure in your fingers is relaxed. That's your diastolic pressure. Now units for these, we'd say 120 millimeters of mercury. 80 millimeters of mercury is what the common units are that we use for this, based on sort of some standard methods for taking blood pressure taken in your doctor's office. This diagram shows how the pressure is very high in arteries and how it starts to drop off as we go into the veins. Remember, arteries are elastic. They're very close to the heart, which provides the pump. So that's going to result in a greater amount of force in the blood vessels closer to the heart. And as we move away from the heart, the blood sort of rubs up against the walls on the inside of the blood vessels. There's some friction there. That causes the blood to slow down, and that causes your pressure to drop. And this is why when we talked about the valves a few seconds ago, the valves were so important to get the blood to move back up towards the heart. So that's it for now. Next video clip, we'll talk about the components of blood.